Hello, everyone. I hope you have been able to work through your different learning activities in the previous modules and that you have dropped your answers to the Padlet in the previous recording. Now, in this recording, really, we are just focusing on the notions of needs. We really want to consider the different concepts and the ends of social welfare, and we are trying to consider very much the concept of needs, and later we shall be looking at the concept of rights, desert, and risk as different ways of conceptualizing social policy. So we shall try to discuss and define key concepts associated with the ends of social policy. We shall try to look at, Jonathan Bradshaw and his 4 typologies of needs. We shall try to explain the difference between the first and second and third generation human rights, which, we shall be looking at in the next few videos. We shall also be looking at the differentiation between welfare claims based on notions of citizenship, rights versus merit, and link these to different welfare regimes we had started discussing about. So social policy is fundamentally about addressing social needs that exist within society and providing for the well-being of all citizens. So these needs really include basic necessities like food, shelter, and so on, but also can even extend to additional needs such as healthcare, income, education, housing, and more needs like that. So the way we construct these needs, and I have to acknowledge that the notion of need itself is a social construction. And when we focus on social needs, it becomes clear that needs are not experienced in isolation, rather they just arise really from our social relationships and the social arrangements in place. So it is important to consider the social context when discussing needs, and social contexts themselves vary. And so therefore the question of need is shaped by the values, but also even the norms we have in place. And this is why we see different approaches to policy approaches and how policy address different needs across societies. So therefore, this raises a fundamental question of conceptualizing needs, what we define as needs, who defines that, whose role is it to decide that something somewhere is a need and it has to be addressed, but even the question of who has the responsibility for addressing those needs when they have been identified. So the term need is therefore often debated in social services and policy sectors. But again, you can see that it is such a politicized and socially constructed notion, even the way we decide and discuss and decide on different needs. So there is therefore an ongoing discussion about what constitutes needs, who has that authority to define them, and who bears even the responsibility of addressing different needs where they have been identified. So you will see examples like, many discussions really revolving around whether something is really a need or simply a want. And what does that mean in terms of how we address them, and who gets to, again, define and decide on all these perspectives. So there are different perspectives on all these issues. So social policy is concerned with the identification of priorities, and the question of priorities becomes, again, very important. We started discussing about conflicting agenda in policy making, that we have many different ideas, many different priorities, but at the same time, we understand that we don't have all the resources, and we've got to be careful on what we prioritize on the social policy agenda. And these conceptualizations on needs, want, preferences become very important when we are trying to do that. So really exploring different ways of conceptualizing needs is therefore an essential part of social policy. So when we are talking about social policy and need, the question of prioritization is naturally an important question. We can simply not avoid it. And we need to be very clear on how we clarify things and how we get to define them as being on the priority agenda versus being marginalized on what needs to be addressed. So we need to consider what people actually need, what they want, and what they would prefer, but even what they would value in relation to whatever policies and even whatever services and services we are designing for them. So the preferences imply giving certain needs and wants priorities over others. And this is where discussing different sorts of needs becomes something very important we really need to start looking at. Jonathan Bradshaw, who's a very important scholar in social policy, worked with the University of York in the UK. So he categorized 4 different typologies of needs, and we really need to look at those in a bit. But let's say that understanding these needs and identifying priorities involves in itself grappling with the fact that we have different groups of people with varying needs, and we need to be very clear on what kind of needs are we talking about, or what kind of needs people are putting forwards, and what does that mean in terms of addressing those needs. So Bradshaw's provided this typology. He provided a typology of 4 kind of needs, speaking initially about the felt needs. That is just what people want. And this is indicated by a subjective judgment by those who have the need. And then he spoke also about the expressed need, that is what people choose. And this refers to the need indicated by the choices of the people themselves about what they prioritize, or what they feel like should come first in terms of addressing things. And then he also spoke about comparative needs. This is just about determining who needs something more by comparing one group's situation over another. And this again is something you see very often policymakers doing when trying to understand, where priorities should be given. And then we have normative needs, which refers to the needs identified by experts. We see this very often in research, and even again policymakers who use best available evidence to guide decisions about which needs should receive priority over another. Just really to give you a flavor about these 4 typologies of needs, provided by Jonathan Bradshaw, which you might want again to read more about in your reading. But technically, all these debates on the needs raises fundamental questions around the question of need itself. What is it? And, how does that relate to the concept of right? And how does that further relate to the question of entitlement? And this is what pretty much many governments around the world are doing in addressing the needs of their citizens. It's not all about just addressing the needs, but it is about defining what these needs are. And if these are determined to be needs, then do they have, do they lead to that leads to the next question, which is around the rights of the people. It's not just because we have identified something to be a need that it has to be addressed. The government would then raise the question of, okay, you need this, is it your right? And that leads to the next question that, yes, you have this need, it is your right, but then do you deserve it? So the question of need calls for the question of right and even the question of entitlement. And I think you can see this being illustrated with the pizza kind of, illustration on that slide. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next recording.